This is probably the 10th installment of what is a 100-day arts challenge. This challenge was proposed to me by my friend Petra. Her and I collaborated on a fine arts project which we took to an exhibition last year. We exhibited the work twice together, and it was surrounded with the idea of farming and agriculture. We got to know each other through art school, and since then we stayed close and went for walks together and talked a lot about how we felt about art and art making and just culture in general. We also had a lot of connection with our interest in films. But when it came to things like challenges, Petra has a great affinity for pushing the boundaries of the art making practice, and I'm a lot more conventional, but we still have this connection with a love of art and art making. So I appreciated her suggesting this to me, and to be honest, for the majority of 2024 I had been editing videos, filming artists, filming in galleries and gallerists, talking to artists in interviews, making Patreon videos, but I hadn't been making any art myself. I do a lot of visits to different exhibitions and artist studios. I've got a lot of friends that I've made in the local area and further afield, and I like to engage with different artists in as many ways as possible. But making art took a bit of a sideline, unfortunately, because of how busy I'd made myself. So engaging with this challenge forced me to then start boxing off a bit of time every day for making a piece of artwork, even if it is just a bit of a doodle or a scribble of some kind. And that's what some of these videos will be. This one is my second oil pastel portrait for this challenge, and after a while I start to get very used to how I'd like to execute the picture and how I feel the medium works best for me. Now, the way that I start is that I do try to source the paper from something which is textured, not on the surface, but it has a visual of texture. It has some kind of static or noise to the surface. I find this a lot on cardboard, but this is paper. This paper is that glossy on one side and matte on the other side paper that you find in picture frames. It will have the measurements of the frame and some kind of pattern or picture on the front, and then when you turn it around it will have a textured background, and that's what I'm drawing on. I really like this because then you eliminate the idea of having something too light that white can be, where it's blinding and you're trying to cover as much of the white as possible to make the picture work. This means that introducing a lighter tone than the surface can really communicate light a lot better than what it does when you're trying to cover the surface with tone from white. That's why I like to use this type of material, and it's been very handy. Either this or cardboard to me is a really useful way of making art a lot quicker and a lot more fun easily, and it's also cheap. If you buy a picture frame and it's just a cheap picture frame, it comes free inside it, and you can either use it to put in the frame afterwards or use the frame for something completely different and have this as a little project that's fun on the side, which, to be totally honest, is how I'm going to use it. I rarely frame pieces like this because it's for this challenge. It's a lot of fun, but I don't really consider it to be something that's viable for a gallery, and I could be wrong. Potentially it could find its way to a group exhibition at some point, but that's something which I'll have to discuss in another video, because I have lots of conflicting thoughts about the gallery scene and the direction my work is taking at the moment. So that's something which I will have to think about a little bit more before I present in a video to discuss with you. The first stage that I have of this piece, as you can see, is drawing with a pen. I'm very comfortable drawing with a fine liner and leaving it as an ink drawing. So to do this as an underdrawing for a pastel painting is a comfort zone for me. It's an easy way for me to plot out the landmarks of the face, the features. But it is quite sketchy. It's not trying to be a clean drawing, so I almost do a chicken scratch. And that was the case with yesterday's video as well. It's probably been lost in the mix somewhere. But if I can remember, I will leave a marker in the top right hand corner of the screen now. And that link is for yesterday's video where I did a pastel painting, portrait painting of my friend John Williams. And in this, it's a bit more scribbly. Actually, it's similarly scribbly to the one I did yesterday. But I wanted to specifically talk about how I use oil pastels in this video. Whereas in that video yesterday, I was talking more about my relationship with John Williams, who's a wonderful person. So, talking about how I use oil pastels, this ink sketching side is very much part of how I use them. I can't imagine using oil pastels without having some kind of an underdrawing. Even though I've done it before, now that I have started with underdrawing as a regular practice for this challenge, it's really made me see the benefits of plotting out the proportions of whatever it is that I'm choosing for a subject. It means that I can really commit to the planes of a face or of a landmark, or a landscape I should say, or a still life. You can really establish that with the marks you make with a pen or pencil first. And the reason I like it as a pen is that it's a committed mark. You can't rub it out. It doesn't fully disappear. The way that I use oil pastels on top of the pen is not to completely cover the pen mark, but to use that as a guide. And then if you see wispy pen lines, I think that's quite a nice contrast from the chunky, rich pigment of an oil pastel and having these thin, wispy lines of a fine liner complement each other because of their differences. That's how I feel about it. But it is scribbly, and I'm certainly not trying to make beautiful pen marks. I'm just trying to make somewhat accurate lines so that I know where the person is on the surface before I start committing to a full render. But the difference between this stage where I'm drawing it in and later on where it becomes a fully fleshed out portrait is huge. But it's also a massive difference between the finish that you can decide when it comes to the style and approach of using the oil pastels. And the difference between this portrait and the video which I linked in the top right earlier of John Williams, I think are quite different. You can tell they're by the same person, but I make several choices in this portrait that I didn't make in the one I made yesterday, or the video I posted yesterday. This video is actually from quite a while ago. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that this drawing stage to me is important, and I think if you're using oil pastels for the first time, I advise that you do some kind of an underdrawing, even if it's far less detailed than I have done here. After this portrait, I start to push out lots of different ideas of people's faces in oil pastels, and I change the amount of detail I draw before I introduce oil pastel to the surface, and it shows how little you need to anchor the person's personality onto the picture plane before you commit with colour. So that is more than enough detail, I think, on the surface. and I think in the future I wouldn't draw that much detail, but that's as much as I draw for this portrait before going in, and I'm going in with light first. Now, I'm talking about how I use oil pastel in this video, and to be completely honest, using a light colour this early on is not how I use it, more these days, but back then it is how I used oil pastel. I was still getting used to how the medium worked, and in my view and my experience, I find that darker tones first work best for me, but it doesn't do a lot of damage to make mistakes and be able to clean them up afterwards. But first, let me talk about, as well as the fact that the approach that I take to using oil pastels is slightly different in this video to how it is modern, more recent portraits. I'd like to more importantly talk about the reference, because that can be a really important place for starting a piece of work. And the reference that I'm using is from an Instagram account called Earth's World. I've linked Earth's World in my Instagram posts, which document a lot of the submissions I have made for this challenge, and they liked the work. They appreciate the credits, and I'm sure they would appreciate you checking them out, so I will link them in the description of this video and also show you on screen who it is that I'm talking about. They have a great repository of images of people attending, I think it's called a state fair in America. Loads and loads of really interesting faces, but very well taken photographs with great light and shadow to utilize as a reference. And reference images are so important when it comes to trying to find a decent personality to describe, but also to feel inspired by the subject before you start to commit to making a piece. The last thing you want to do is say, I'm a fan of, Nicolas Cage, and so I will find an image of Nicolas Cage and draw him, and then you get bored partway through and can't decide what exactly it is that you're trying to say. That can happen. I've experienced that. So in this piece, what I'm trying to do is to capture humanity in someone who isn't famous, but someone who you can see an interesting glimpse of who this person is in this moment that the photograph was taken of them, and trying to honour that without replicating the photograph. That is my intention, is to not replicate the source material, but instead to use that as a way to kickstart my interest in making a picture in the first place. So source material, a huge inspiration and appreciation that I have for the fact that Earth's World shares their images readily with artists to use. So I very much appreciate them and hope that you check them out if you need inspiration or source material to use for portraiture. And if you do, then please credit them, because they deserve crediting, and that is the ethical way to use reference material that isn't your own. Now, using oil pastels can be tricky in a way, because if you haven't used them before, they can feel a bit sticky and a bit waxy, and I was more used to using soft pastels than oil pastels. So I was used to a dustier but more buttery smooth way of spreading pigment on a surface, but with mounds of pigment as just piles of just tiny little pieces just stacked up that you couldn't afford to let any kind of airflow blow around the room. So I would tip it into little cups and jars and tubs and containers to make sure that my soft pastels wouldn't be wasted. You can always tip those onto another surface and spread them around with a brush or with your finger or with water. With oil pastels, it's very different. They don't have this pile of dusty pigment that's mounded up. They are quite dry in comparison. That's actually not true. Soft pastels are more dry. They're actually wet in comparison. It's quite the opposite of what I just said. They feel sticky. Not sticky in a nasty way or an unpleasant way. That's how I initially felt about oil pastels. But now that I've got to use them more often, I find them really pleasant in a very different way. But I've learned to make quite dramatic and brave decisions when it comes to light and shadow. And you may be inclined to just go gentle into your approach of how to use them, and that's probably going to work for you if you find a comfortable pathway through to creating your own piece of artwork. My pathway is to get a dramatically dark colour, a really rich colour, and to pop it down on the surface as a shadow area. Now you can see that I'm just dabbing this. More recently, I would scrub this darker colour onto the surface because I know that the strength that I have with oil pastels is in blending. The blending happens when you've laid down a dark colour and then you go on top of it with a lighter colour. You have to know which colours you're using and why, but the way that they work nicely in my experience is that you lay down something very rich and then you put something a lot more flat and washed out and grey on top. Not literally grey, but you see how these pinks aren't really bright pink. You see the pink I've put down first was very light, and the pink that I'm putting down now is a mid pink. It's still not really a strong poppy Barbie pink. It's still very pale pink. So that's what I mean. It's a contrast between the really rich, strong, dark, highly saturated colours and the much lighter tertiary colours on top of the darker ones. And I'm not doing that in this yet, but that does happen. It's so early on in my practice with oil pastels that I'm being really cautious and trying to make sure that I don't make a big mistake too early in this process. So I'm only doing things that I'm confident I can get away with. These days, I know what I get away with. I know how they work much better, and I'm far more efficient with how to apply oil pastels in a more bold and confident way than I'm doing in this portrait. But I really like how this works out, so that's why I wanted to talk about my process in this video more than others, because it shows that there's more than one way to do a very similar thing. It's just a bit slower in this one. Now you can see I'm putting down a very light tone all over the face. I could have done that first if that's what I was going to do, but I didn't make that decision. And I don't think that's necessarily how I would do it now, because the face needs to communicate a light and a shadow area. So what I'm doing with these delicate touches is to try and feel what looks natural and what feels like it could be a mistake and needs covering up. The positive that I've found with oil pastels is that you can cover things up quite easily. Oil pastels to me feel like a nice compromise between drawing and painting. I've heard from enough artists that this is a pastel painting. I consider it half drawing, half painting. The reason for that is it feels like drawing because of the action is not with a brush or a palette knife. But it feels like painting when the oil pastel starts to build up quite thickly on the surface, and you're pushing one colour into another, and you're then blending these colours together in order to create an effect or a texture on the surface. That feels more like painting to me than drawing. You can do that with drawing, but the actual experience of doing that with these colours feels like painting. In my view, if I would add white spirit or terps or some kind of thinner to this to create a thinner layer and be able to push around some of these colours with a brush or something, some way to, whatever instrument it is, that would feel more like painting. But I'm probably wrong, as I've had people with far greater authority than me tell me this is painting. That's not the point. The point is, I think you can already see this looks somewhat painterly and much stronger than the initial marks offered when it came to making a portrait. I'm a big fan of Vincent van Gogh, and I'm not saying that this is anything like Vincent van Gogh, but I can see inspiration from him in this piece. Perhaps that is too grandiose a claim, but it feels to me like you can see my love of his work in this portrait just because of the drawing aesthetic of colour, and I feel as though that is something which I really love with Van Gogh's work. Now you can see this very hot pink that I just added to the ear. The interesting thing is, when I did that, I thought that's too much, I need to cover it up. So I get a lot lighter a pink and go on top, and look at what it does. It really softens and lightens what I've just put down, but in an interesting way, where the colour that I'm using at the moment is a very light pink, but it carries some of that really hot pink with it, and it pushed it around the ear to give it a warmth that suggests that this is a thin layer of skin where you can see the blood underneath the skin, and that's what we see. I really like this about oil pastels, that they offer this type of communication. This is what I aim for when I make a portrait, a landscape, a still life. Anything which is trying to discuss observations and appreciations about the world we live in can be aided by these movements that the materials give you. This blending and interaction between the strong colours and the weaker colours are, to me, the positive actions that can occur in the creating of a piece of artwork. It's unpredictable because of how blunt some of these pieces are, these pieces of oil pastel I mean. You can see it doesn't have a very sharp edge, so I'm being very careful of where to touch them. But to try and concentrate the warm areas onto the ears and the nose and the lips, I think is a very human look. It reminds me of people in wintertime. Even at this stage, I feel as though you could almost see the subject's breath in the air. And I find that very pleasant to see as a developing reality to the piece and validity to the portrait. And even drawing these very warm and highly saturated marks on top of the much more gentle side is only going to develop this description of light and shadow. And it's such an important part of making portraits or making art of any kind, is the tonality of your work. The tonal values of artwork are some of its strongest means of communication with the viewer. Even from a thumbnail, very, very small version of the image, the light and dark will communicate something very strong to the viewer that, if it isn't there, will be absent. That may seem obvious, but if it's absent in the work, then it's something that you haven't utilised, which is there for you to really take advantage of. Now, it's not only strong light and strong shadow, which could be either chiaroscuro or tenebrism. Chiaroscuro being the delicate interplay between light and shadow, and tenebrism being the more severe juxtaposition of really bright light and really dark shadow. There is this nuance which I'm trying to use as well, which is the mid-tone range. This is where it's not especially light, not especially dark. There's light mid-tone and there's dark mid-tone. Understanding that in colour can be the key to making very strong portrait, landscape, still life, or even abstract. So what I'm using at the moment is a grey on top of the background colour, which is tonally very similar to the grey. It's probably equivalent to the grey, in fact maybe even slightly darker. But all I'm doing is trying to create some suggestion in the hair of these parts where the light is different. And I know that I need to go back into the hair and create a contrast. But what I mean by the light is different is that the light is captured in the hair, or it's reflecting on parts of the hair. And I need that to be a balance with darker tones and perhaps even some colours. There are so many ways to make portraits, and why not do something interesting with them? Now, I've got so many warm colours in this portrait that it's almost a relief to introduce this cooler tone, this light greeny blue, into the eyes. Is that a teal? You tell me in the comments if you know if that's teal. But it's, to me, very impactful now to see that colour amongst all of these warms. Even the really light pink is a warm tone compared to the light blue of the eyes. The grey is a cool, but it's a mid-tone cool that doesn't really have much impact until it is up against something which creates a contrast, which makes it vibrate. So the hair at the moment is quite flat, just like his clothing. And there's far more to be done with the face. So it's just a case of picking away at what is important. And at this point, what's important is just the development of certain aspects of the portrait. So to give the eyes a bit of a soul, to give them a centre, the pupil gives it that humanity. And you've got to be very careful because of how blunt oil pastels are. But you can see the communication on the skin of light and shadow. The light is obviously coming from the left-hand side. This is the way that you look at it, it's the left. If it were the subject, it would be on his right. I've now added dark to the underside of the top of the eyelid. This gives weight to the eyelid and suggests that the light is shining downward. It's what you often see when it comes to a light source. And now it just becomes a case of finding where the light and the shadow dance around each other, removing certain marks with the lighter tones and making important decisions with the darker either mid-tones or even shadow that can be created with darker, richer, more highly saturated colours. What I was doing on the left was introducing a warmer pink to what was a flat area, and now I'm just interrupting some of this warm shadow area with the same pink. It just makes it more interesting than leaving something scribbled on and not in discussion with another colour. If you can create this discussion, this conversation between this fiery red and yellow and this mid-pink, they start to sit together in an interesting way that communicates skin tones, light and temperature in a more interesting way. It's trying to describe the planes of the skin, where the face turns, where the bone structure is visible through the skin, and where the skin is a thinner layer and where it's a thicker layer, as I discussed earlier with the representation of warmth in the ears, the nose and the lips. But now it's time to push forward with this portrait and suggest light and shadow. Just because this is the the shadow side, doesn't mean that light won't be captured or touching that side of the face. It will, quite often. And because of the strong reference that I'm using, I can now use that to guide me of where I need to suggest certain reflections of light, certain moments where the skin or the beard or the hair have found a warmth or a cool reflection. But aside from light and shadow, it is important to try to maintain textures. The beard shouldn't look the same as the skin. The ears shouldn't look the same as the forehead. Texture is important. The folds and the crevices of certain parts of our anatomy are powerful when they're even just suggested, just hinted at slightly. We will read that more than if you do a photorealistic work. I find that a lot of the power of a face will be lost because of the infinite detail on every aspect. That's my personal preference speaking there. It's not necessarily a truth. It's my own feeling. My impression of artwork is that when certain things are sharp and other things are soft, there is more interest because it speaks to our own vision and experience, and therefore our memory speaks through the artwork, whether it's our own or someone else's. It speaks to us in a way of our experience. And this isn't something I'm necessarily thinking about consciously, but subconsciously there is a consideration of reality and at the same time artistic interpretation and creative license. Balancing these things are to me the key to creating something which is truly your own. If I were to completely copy the source material, I wouldn't feel as though I were offering much to the viewer or to myself. The fact that we can deviate consciously, not accidentally, gives us the ability to then make decisions which speak to our own preferences and our own voice. Making mistakes shouldn't be a way that we then say that's my style. We shouldn't explain mistakes away as style. We should criticize our own mistakes and realise that we need to improve upon certain aspects of our drawing or painting or observations in order to try and understand what we're seeing as clearly as possible. If we want to have this level of artistic mastery that we have seen, heard of, and appreciated for centuries. This is taking advantage of the freedom to interpret certain aspects of the creative process. You can see here the texture that I am describing of a woolly jumper. That's what the subject is wearing. And by flattening the oil pastel on the surface and very lightly scrubbing it down the surface means that I can then create this suggestion of a woolly texture. And then if you draw on top, it becomes darker and more matte. The matte finish is suggesting shadow and potentially creases in the clothing. But it's also, just because I've created this texture doesn't mean that I should leave it as it is. I think it's worth ensuring that tonally it works on the piece. And part of that is going to be returning to the hair as I'm doing here. That is a flat part of the portrait currently, and it needs some interplay between the grey that I introduced earlier and this darker black that I have now. But instead of being just black and grey, hair should be considered as a surface that reflects light and colour, just as every other surface does. It has its own intrinsic colour to it, but that is influenced and affected by its environment. So my thought process is to establish the shape and the texture first, and then to introduce certain aspects of light and atmosphere. One thing I don't want is black and grey hair sat on such a colourful face. It wouldn't serve the piece. And it would also reflect a lack of interest. It's fine for the woolly jumper, which is not necessarily going to be colourful, even though you do have the freedom to do that. But the hair is part of the human body and should really be considered in a different way and be thought of as an organic form that you can describe with colour. Light, shadow and texture are some of the key principles that I have found describe any subject in an interesting and dynamic way. Whether you have 1 minute or you have 1 year to make a piece of artwork, if those 3 aspects of art making are considered, then you will always find something which can push beyond the reference material and into a personal realm of your own thoughts and feelings. For this person that I'm drawing or painting at the moment, I feel as though the more I start to gently introduce colour and light, the more I feel the personality becomes prevalent and the life of the subject is apparent. It still can be a very artistic image. It doesn't have to be a photograph. It doesn't have to be a very finely rendered portrait, it can be very rough and scribbled. But if it's considered, the scribbles are controlled. They're not wild and unwieldy. They are within the framework of this discipline. It still has, to me, Van Gogh elements. Again, I apologise for the comparison, but I think it's part of the marks that I let interrupt others. I was going to say introduce, but I introduce the marks into the areas, such as the light white colour on the eyebrow on the right hand side, on top of the darker, warmer pinks. But also the darker, warmer reds and pinks look as though they are marks. You can almost see them as contoured hatching. That to me speaks to what I appreciate about Van Gogh's work. And I'm not trying to emulate Van Gogh or compare myself to the greatness of his work, but I am trying to suggest that there is inspiration that can be utilised by introducing certain techniques like that to your work. And I don't do that very often. For the remainder of my portraits with oil pastels, I don't think I do another which is like this, in this style, or has any resemblance to honouring my admiration for Van Gogh's portraiture. So it's not consistent, even though I think you will see a through line with all of my portraits with oil pastel. They're very much of a voice, I think, of my own lens on the world. But this one I feel is stronger because of that similarity in certain aspects. And it's more on the shadow side, I think. These touches of yellow introduced into the beard show the skin tone beneath the hair. It's tempting to put down white and grey for hair and not to remember that you can see the skin through a beard in certain places. And to remember that gives an influence to the viewer's observation of your work, that they are looking at a living, breathing person and not just a comic book character. Again, not to denigrate comic book characters either, which I have quite a reverence for. But I think all I mean is that nothing which is too flat for what we're trying to achieve. Darker marks in the hair will suggest form. Where the hair goes in, the light should not shine. Where it sticks out, the light should capture the edges. Now the hair is just black and grey at the moment. And as I mentioned earlier, there are opportunities to introduce colour into the hair. So I've decided to introduce a green to the hair. This may seem like an odd choice, and perhaps it is. But to introduce colour to the hair suggests the environment that the person is in. Perhaps they are somewhere where there are green lights, or some kind of reflection of the environment on them, which suggests that the yellow on their skin is a similar reflection to the green in the hair, and it's simply because of the colour difference between the skin and hair where that light is reflected that way. And I found if you introduce a colour and then go over it with another to kill it slightly, to deaden it, that's where I think there is an interesting introduction of a new colour or a stronger colour into these portraits. Leaving the marks on their own can be fine and interesting, but to interrupt them and to scrub back parts of them, almost cutting in, is what makes it feel more painterly. and I think gives the portrait a strength that it would otherwise lack were it to have been left as a matte finish. The finish of this type of work is important. Trying to know when to stop and what you want your piece to look like takes experience and confidence. A lot of artists I talk to really value stopping in the production of the art, the practice itself, and stepping back, giving themselves some distance so that they can reflect upon what they've made, what they do and don't like. Introducing a yellow colour into the green here as well, just to show that the hair can be given the reflection of the environment and also a continuity of some of the colours that have been already established in the face. When it comes to stopping and knowing that you are happy with what you've made, it means that you have tried enough different avenues or introduced enough different ways to describe the form that you can then see the light, the shadow, the shape, the texture. And it usually takes a contrast between washed out lighter colours and more saturated heavier ones, darker, more vacuous blacks, duller and flatter greys and whites, alongside vibrant pinks, oranges and greens. This piece itself may not look finished to some people, but as I'm coming close to the end, I can see that beneath a mount and behind a frame, this could speak quite well alongside a collection of other portraits, and I think would engage guests to a space where these types of works could live. This piece hasn't currently been put behind a frame, but I can imagine it is one of several which I am quite fond of. And these last few touches are the icing on the cake, in my view. I think there's enough here to feel satisfied that I have described a person and honoured their character with oil pastels. The back and forth between laying down some marks and blending on top of them with others is the strength of this type of work, and it is the enjoyment that I've experienced with the medium. I do appreciate that in the future I will push to do much better than this, but for now it is where I've found a lot more enjoyment in the process of making a portrait, of speaking to the humanity of the people around us, and of the love of making a pastel portrait with oil pastels as opposed to soft pastels. Quite a different feeling, but I do encourage you to try it if you haven't already. I hope you have enjoyed this video, because it's one of very many that I've made and very many to come.